You got the scenario is like 2 ohms, high velocity, turn it 90-degree angle into the thermal port. Okay, you're just like, what do you think the Empire's thinking?
Yeah, pretty low risk.
Yeah, dude, like that's not very likely. And then what's the impact if that happens?
Huge, right?
Well, but yeah, and also we got to factor in 𝗂𝗀𝗀𝗃𝗀. Like we didn't know that was the vulnerability was exposed because he planted it. He said,
Reactor module, that's the key. That's the place I've laid my trap. It's well hidden and unstable. One blast to any part of it will destroy the entire station.
So lesson number 1, don't force someone that hates you to build your security program.
yeah, yes, yes. Have you talked to Brad lately? Okay, Mike, so what do you think of when you hear the word risk besides South America? Let's be real here.
Yeah.
What do you think of?
Good question. Prior to being part of Paramify, I would have assumed hackers and, anonymous, and that would have been about the extent of it.
Yeah, and that's like in particular cyber risk, right? But risk can come from anything, right? So when I think of risk, I always tell you guys, I think of what? Like, what's the one thing I think about all the time? Star Wars, right? When Star Wars is like good, it's really good. And when Star Wars is bad, it's still pretty good.
Still pretty good.
Still pretty good. I don't know if I feel the same lately. I mean, like Acolyte was really horribly bad. I didn't finish it.
I didn't even start it.
Yeah. So like, anyway, some people liked it, but I'm just not a fair person
Star Wars
sometimes.
shills.
Okay, so let's talk about risk management.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's start with the Death Star. The Death Star is big. It's expensive. That's no moon.
That's no moon. It's a space station.
Right?
Right.
It's not a moon. Okay. All right, so it has a value, and it also, okay, so that's the asset, right? We start with, there's an asset, okay? It's got some sort of value. We have 1 Death Star. And then we've got a small thermal exhaust port. It's the size of a womp rat. So it's like the size of this table.
Yeah.
Womp rats, everybody knows.
A typical womp rat.
Yeah, so like Luke Skywalker, he used to hunt them with his T-16 back on Tatooine, so it's...
You didn't.
Yeah, you're a hunter, right?
Yep.
And so you identify with that, right? Okay, so there's a little vulnerability on that big, huge Death Star, little one right in there. Okay, so that's a vulnerability. And that was there because 𝗂𝗀𝗀𝗃𝗀𝗃 put it there.
I've placed a weakness deep within the system. A flaw so small and powerful they will never find it.
You guys know who 𝗂𝗀𝗀𝗃𝗀𝗃 is?
Yep.
Hero. Okay, so we've got big Death Star, we've got a little vulnerability, and then we've got a little X-Wing that's a threat. Okay, so we've got a threat, and then we have, what do we do to protect against those little threats, right? Those little X-Wings.
Yeah, we got turrets, we've got TIE fighters. We've got the dark side of the Force.
That's right, we got Darth Vader.
Yep.
He's pretty good, right? Okay, so, right, we'll call those controls. Okay, there's controls. There's even before that, there's a force field, right? So there's like a preventative control around the Death Star. You following?
Yeah.
Yeah,
yep.
dude, this is so good. We had our best people on this. Okay, so anyways, we have this little guy. So this guy circumvents a lot of controls, right? Luke Skywalker, he gets through, they get through the force field. There's just too many of them, and they get in, and then Luke Skywalker is all that's left. Everybody else has been taken care of by the controls, but there's a little threat. And he's going through, and then dark side of the Force, Darth Vader. You remember what he says? Darth Vader gets in there, and he's like,
I have you now.
I have you now.
Yeah. And then what happens, right? You have Han Solo comes in. Han Solo to the rescue. LOL, right? Pew pew, shoots the other guys, right? And you have a control failure right there, right? So there's the control failure. And then all of a sudden, Luke Skywalker's got just a straight shot, and it's a perfect 90-degree turn, into the hole, and it blows up, right? And so we have an impact, right? Okay, and so that's where, if I'm explaining it to my kids, that's where risk management starts, is you have what? So you have an asset, you have a vulnerability, you have a threat, right? You have you have a control, right? Or you have many controls, right? And those are supposed to mitigate the risk. And in the event of those control failures, you need to know what those are at all times, right? So risk management can be really simple if you let it be, but it can also be like incredibly complex. And we just don't really think, like humans, we don't think really in terms of risk naturally, right?
Yeah, so tell me why that matters. When we fast forward to, just as a side note, we talk about thinking of risk. Risk goes hand in hand a lot of times with compliance. And compliance, people tend to get distracted by the controls, right? So they look at a list of like, you have to have turrets, you have to have TIE fighters, you have to have a force field, you have to have whatever. But why is it important to start by looking at risk?
It's great, right? Because you need to understand what matters, like at the very beginning. For example, when you start a business, you don't start it just to avoid risk, right? You start it to make some sort of impact. So for us, like if we want to think of where to start, let's start with like our organization. So we have some goals, right? So our first goals are going to be like, hey, starting a business, we want to make a lot of money. And, like if that's all we want, I mean, what could we do? What could we do? We could sell cigarettes. And that'd be great, right? And we can like make a ton of money, and like we could sell like all sorts of addictive drugs and just make a ton of money if that's our goal, right? But most companies like have something bigger than that. Most founders like have some sort of mission, right, where they want to make the world a better place, right? So that's where we start, I think. And then it's all about what are the objectives, right? So for us, it's like we want to make risk management approachable to anyone. And like you said, like Ratatouille, anyone can cook, anyone can do risk management. Anyone can, but not everybody should, because you really do sacrifice your social life to get good at this stuff, right? I mean, that's what I did. And so we want to make it approachable for everyone. That's our noble goal. And we need to make money for our people, right? Okay, so what are some of the objectives of our organization, right? So we need to delight our customers. What's another one, right?
Yeah, and like the overarching one obviously is, we make risk management approachable by eliminating the biggest headache and heartache of it, which directly is typically the documentation piece of it. Yeah.
So absolutely. So we're zeroed in on that. And so we have to be really good at that. We also need to be operationally efficient, right? We want to have a good community to help us there. So we have all these objectives. And then from there's key functions that need to exist, and they exist in every business, right? So besides the Death Star, like, I don't know, what's their vision? Like rule everything, right? It's pretty hard. Right, but they can blow up planets, right? So it's like a big stick. So that's their mission, and they want to protect that. I mean, anyways, kind of sad, but anyway.
Just to clarify that, we're not the Empire. That's all.
Yeah. We would never do that. Right?
We're definitely the Rebel Alliance.
Yeah, we're definitely the Rebel. Yeah, we're exploiting those vulnerabilities all day. We could do this all day. Anyway, okay, so I think I'm trailing off, but those are the things that we need to think of first. What is the purpose of the organization in the first place? And oftentimes it's not to like fulfill a checkbox, right? To check a checkbox. That is not it. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to think about what is the inherent likelihood and the inherent impact of the threats, without any controls. So let's just say the Death Star is just floating in outer space, no force fields, no turrets, no anything. That's like pretty risky, right? It's exposed to a lot of risk.
And really costly.
really
if it
costly.
gets exploited, yeah.
Yeah, I think some nerds figured it out. I think the cost was like, what is this? We have Keaton in here. I don't know what this is. It's 193 septillion galactic credits.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot.
What's the exchange rate to dollars on this?
It's pretty good.
It's pretty good.
It's pretty good. And then you have all of the head count, right, of your people. Like, so you have to pay, 130,000 credits per year, right, for the stormtroopers, right? And also they're priceless, the stormtroopers.
Yeah.
Right. And then you have like, the GDP impact, right? Because it's doing business with all sorts of different, all those different planets. Alderaan, before they blew it up, I'm sure it was part of it. There's some. It's a big asset that they want to protect, right? Let's figure out what they did wrong. So, what's the inherent likelihood? So it's just this little vulnerability, right? It's this little womp rat-sized vulnerability on a big, huge planet killer, right? So we think about like, what is it? And so now we need to think about risk treatment. Okay, so this is where we start. I like to think about risk in terms of what am I responsible for and the people that I interact with. So the very first thing that you can do with risk is, am I going to mitigate this risk? And so you're going to mitigate that risk, and you can either do it by yourself or you can get others to help you out, right? So when I mitigate it, I'm going to minimize it with controls. I'm going to enhance it. So I'm going to add a force field. That's a good one. We're going to add turrets. We're going to have all sorts of things, right? Manned battle stations all over the place, right? So those are the first things that we do. What's the second thing that I could do with the risk? Like, so bring it maybe to cyber, right? Like, I don't want to be in charge of, mitigating the risk of physical security, right? Mm-hmm. So
it's bringing in partners, saying like, oh, I can hire somebody, or I could, instead of building my own data center, I'll deploy an AWS and they will guard. That's right. The data center.
So I can share the risk,
Mm-hmm.
So I can use a component, like maybe a firewall in AWS, so I can have AWS security groups that I'm responsible to configure, but AWS provides them for me and they make it really easy. And so in that way I share it, right? And so we can share it. And
share the load.
We can share the load.
In the wise words of 𝗂𝗵𝗫𝗀𝗃.
Yep. He's a good guy.
There's another great example of a vulnerability being exploited,
Ooh.
Sauron never saw it coming.
Yep.
That ring dropping in Mount Doom.
Yep. Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, I agree.
Can we get nerdier than Star Wars? Yes, we can.
Oh, dude. We haven't even talked about Dune yet.
Long live the fighters. Okay, so we can mitigate it. We can share it.
Then we can also just transfer it all together.
Yeah.
Right. We say, so the two ways we can do that. So Palpatine probably had insurance on his Death Star, because otherwise, how could he have gotten all the money for the fully operational Death Star? Right. The second one, it would have been way too expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even though it's made up, but still, you can imagine. All right. So you can have insurance that, hey, if this thing blows up, give me some money. Right. And people are.
So you're offloading the risk.
You're offloading the risk. Yeah, but the other way you transfer it altogether, where we have like full inheritance, is where you transfer the risk of physical security to AWS, because there's nothing that you or I can do that's going to, improve the physical security of, an AWS data center. We just use it, right? So we can outsource that. The other thing we can do, so when we do this in our engagements, you can say, hey, so what are you doing for file integrity protection, right? So do you have change windows to turn this on? And some people go, I don't really need that. So they might accept certain risks altogether. Okay, So they say, I'm just going to accept it. It's fine. It's a deliberate decision.
The likelihood's low enough. The impact is low enough that even if it got exploited, I'm fine with it.
Yeah, you're just, and there's a lot of that, right? And then there's like, you just like, you see the risk, you take a sip of your drink, and you're just like, meh, I don't care, right? And you just like kind of move on. And then there's finally, you can avoid the risk altogether, right? And it's like kind of like when I was dating, right? It's too scary. I just don't want to do it, right? And so you just kind of like look and watch everybody, and I'm not going out there. Yeah, you might choose, you know, I don't want to be in the cloud business. I don't want to do cybersecurity, which total respect, man. It sucks sometimes, right? But if you choose to do business, you need to decide whether you're going to mitigate, share, transfer, or accept, because you can't really avoid the risk, you know, because you're in it, right? So once the Death Star is there, there's no avoiding risk. You have to manage it.
Yep.
Right. Okay, so we got risk treatment, right? So what are those? Again, it's mitigate, it's share,
transfer, accept, or avoid it.
That's right. So those are kind of the ways to do it. And I would say beyond that, there's kind of a spectrum of, you know, when you're deciding to mitigate, there it's like, hey, I'm going to transfer some of the risk altogether. There's some of it over here that I'm going to share. And then also on our end, we're going to have customers that we share the risk with as well, right? Okay. So, all right. So we've got, at some point, we can have the inherent likelihood and the inherent impact of a threat exploiting a vulnerability with controls in place, right? So we got to put those controls in place, and that's called the residual risk.
So that's after, so we have our initial risk. If the Death Star is just floating in space, the likelihood that somebody goes and blows it up is pretty high. Once we have all of the protections around it, the likelihood feels pretty low.
Yeah, we put the controls in place and it's super low. Okay, so now we have something, and so we kind of like put our heads together, and we have two ways of assessing risk, right? So the first one's going to be like qualitative risk assessment. Okay, all right. So let's do. We can use anything that comes to your brain. I like to think of qualitative risk as where experience really matters, right? So let's say, for example, Star Wars is real, okay? And you don't know about Darth Vader, and you see this Darth Vader walks into the bar, and he's got this freaking ridiculous costume and a bent on, and you think that's great, and you go up to him and you say, hey man, which one of these buttons calls your mom to pick you up, right? And so, but we're like watching it and like, oh, he doesn't know, because we've seen Darth Vader in staff meetings, right?
Yeah.
He like loses his cool and like chokes people out, right, with the Force. And we're like, dude, so that's like, what is that? Like messing with someone like that, that's high risk, right? It's just like shooting from the hip, yeah, don't do that, right? You know, it's kind of like my kids, like they have no street smarts growing up in Utah, right? So they didn't have any. I grew up in a tougher neighborhood, right?
You were from the wrong side of the tracks.
Dude, it's true. It's true. I mean, there's good people everywhere, but like I had to learn a little bit about street smarts pretty early on, and there's certain things you just never say, right, to the wrong people. And so if you do that, you're at high risk of death, right? Like instant death, right? To Darth Vader. Okay, so let's go back to the little womp rat size vulnerability on the Death Star. Okay, you got the scenario is like 2 bombs, high velocity, turn it 90-degree angle into the thermal port. Okay, you're just like, what do you think the Empire is thinking?
Yeah, pretty low risk.
Yeah, dude, like that's not very likely. And then what's the impact if that happens?
Huge, right?
Well, but yeah. And also, we got to factor in Galen Erso. Like, we didn't know that was the vulnerability was exposed because he planted it. He said,
𝗷𝗂𝗪𝗏, that's the key. That's the place I've laid my trap. It's well hidden and unstable. One blast to any part of it will destroy the entire station.
So lesson number 1, don't force someone that hates you to build your security program.
yeah, yes, yes. Have you talked to Brad lately?
He's avoiding our calls.
Love you, Brad. Also, Mike Cook and Isaac.
Yeah, they're great.
Yeah, we love them. Love you guys. So anyways, but for them, they're probably thinking like, probably low, like even if that happened, but probably nothing's gonna happen, right?
That's how you said it. The whole system goes down.
And so they probably made that decision like, hey, like it's fine, right? You know, it's low risk. Like don't even do anything different, right? And when you're talking about enterprise risk and you're going to a manager and you say like, hey, the risk is low, or the risk is high, or the risk is moderate or medium, your board is they're going to be like, what does that mean?
Yep.
Right? And so you can't quantify it. So that's kind of where those qualitative risk assessments, you really need to demonstrate some sort of like trust and make sure that you have, experience in place. So experience really matters with qualitative risk assessment. And then I just said the other thing is the quantitative, right? So quantitative is much tougher, right? But what it's trying to do is trying to put some sort of equation and some sort of quantity on, all of it, right? And so the risk equals really the probability of a threat times the probability of a vulnerability times like what's the assets that are affected. That's really what your risk is. And so that becomes really hard. So you have your risk impact, that's like big R, right? So big R is that. And then on the other side of the equation, just take like P, so like what's the probability? And then we're gonna put in that first bracket a T, right? And that's gonna be your threat. And then we're gonna go times the probability, so another little lowercase p, times the vulnerability in brackets. And then we're going to say by the assets impacted, and that's our like total risk, right? And so we know what to do the other day, right? So Seth, the other day, I was like getting tickets to the 49ers game, and it said, hey, do you want to buy, do you want to purchase
insurance?
Do you want to buy insurance? And then we were able to, you could just do it like right after, like right away. You could say, hey, what's the probability that you don't go, And then he's like, we just did a like quick calculation. He said, yeah, you should pay $18 for that insurance. But the insurance costs like $300. So I'm like, nah, not gonna do it, right? But that's like really helpful. So in this case, we already knew like what the threat was, right? And then we knew what the vulnerability is, and then we knew the assets impacted, right? The probability, you got it from Han Solo.
Great shot, kid. That was 1 in a million.
Remember, right after he shoots,
1 in a million.
1 in a million. Okay, so that would have been really hard to guess, but I don't know. The risk impact totally. I actually figured this out. I spent some time. And it ended up being like something like 92 billion, right? 92 billion galactic credits. I don't know how much that is in dollars, US dollars. But that's like hard, right, to do that. So I think it's a little bit of a balance, right? Quantitative and qualitative. I've never seen qualitative like work great because it's so hard. And so we always default back to these like qualitative assessments, and then you can mix in a few quantitative measures. Obviously, we know which assets are the most important. We know anybody who's been in a business long enough knows what they have to have, right? And they know those levers that they need to pull. And so it's all about, making sure that you're continually assessing, the risks. With cyber, you don't really have to start from the beginning, right? It's just a matter of, finding out where is your data. And when you put it in something like AWS, already you're transferring some of the risk to like a really great institution, or Google or Microsoft or Oracle, whatever it is, right? You're transferring a lot of that risk. If you're doing it all by yourself, it's kind of like one hand tied behind your back, doing it. So it's just, it's a little bit easier also because you have these control frameworks that have already kind of said, hey, what do you need to think about?
Yeah. No, and these principles are great, even outside of just cyber risk. We see it all the time, even in just, working and in a startup, you see it with redlining legal documents. It's all about, managing your risk if something goes wrong, with hiring plans, with compensation plans, with, forecasting, all of it. And so I think it's a good framework to take a look at it. And to not, I think the default for a lot of people, like you said at the very beginning, is there are certain ways to deal with the risk, but you don't want to just pretend it's not there. Right. It's good to acknowledge it and then to make a conscious decision like, okay, am I accepting this? Am I avoiding it? Am I going to transfer it? Whatever it might be. Yep,
absolutely. So just to kind of close up, if I have this little stack environment, I have this little picture, I'm just going to put it together, right? We can show it on we'll get Keaton on this, man. He's our best people, man. Get it on it. So we have a stack environment. What do we need to know? We need to know where the data is, like right off the bat. Need to know where the data is. Where are you deployed? That's the first thing. And then you need to know who's interacting with that data and who's protecting it. And then what are the processes? What is the tech? So the people, places, and things, people, process, technology that's working to protect that data. Then you kind of know about those threats. And so what's great about security is we know what a lot of those are. So like threat is like a stolen password, or a threat of smishing, or a threat of some sort of zero-day exploit that's coming. And so the risk, so if you have that little stack environment, the risk is this area over here, and then you have all these little risk ninja stars coming at you, right? And so what are you going to do to protect against that? And so that's where risk treatment starts. And usually there's a lot of good solutions already out there that can help you kind of identify that. You don't have to start from the beginning. There's firewalls that have been put together for a long time. And now they're in the cloud. There's lots of protections there. There's password managers with like 𝗏𝗏security and 1Password, Bitwarden, things like that. Multi-factor authentication, and that's getting better. And just patch management solutions that come into play that people already know how to do those, and you do not have to start from ground zero. Yeah. Right. So I love it. Anyways, so risks, I think we're pretty good on that, right? I think we get it. So, yeah. We both obviously understood that very in depth at the very beginning. Yeah. Well, I actually know you do. No, that's a great overview. And I think it's a good foundation to start from, because once you have an understanding of balancing and treating risk, now we can kind of go into like, okay, so if we're going to build a risk management program at a company, if we're going to, focus on cyber and specifically, then we've got a good framework to work from. That's right. I think that's awesome. Awesome. Well, I guess we'll move on to the next thing. We're going to talk a little bit about how to assess risk, right? Or maybe from a controls perspective. So how do we inspect those turrets? We can move away from Star Wars, I think. We'll leave it here. We'll leave it behind. Yeah, maybe. We'll thank Star Wars for its service. And yeah. Okay. Maybe we do talk about Star Wars. We'll decide before the next one. All right. Thanks, everyone.